Welcome everyone on Friday 16th of July to 2021 to the online Ian Ramsey Centre Summer Conference of this strange year, because we're still under COVID conditions, pandemic conditions, and so we decided to make this an entirely virtual event this year. But seems working well so far, so I'm just hoping we're going to continue with that good track record. The theme of this year's conference is natural theology, and to judge from the very wide range of interesting papers that have been submitted, is stimulating a lot of academic interest. So we're very pleased to be holding this conference. Ian McGeochris talk last night, and also the talk of our first plenary speaker this morning, really are rooted in the study of psychology and the human brain and nervous system. And I think for many of us, we feel that natural theology and also science and religion are looking more and more to psychology and neuroscience. It's a great frontier. You know, we've studied physics a lot the last few centuries, physics and philosophy, physics and natural theology. We've studied biology a lot for the last few centuries, biology and natural theology and biology and religion. But the big frontier area is ourselves as human beings. You know, the human brain nervous system is so extraordinary. And whatever else we are both beings capable of science and beings capable of religion. And so this seems to be a nexus point that we really need to focus on in a big way. So it's very appropriate to have natural theology as the theme, and it's especially appropriate that many of our speakers have this emphasis on psychology and neuroscience. Professor Petrovich embodies the interdisciplinary spirit of Oxford, which is not always realized quite as well as it should be. But Professor Petrovich is both in the Department of Experimental Psychology and also an associate member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion here at Oxford. And I have to admit, I don't know a great deal about her work, but I do notice that she has been around the world and she's been looking at the way that human beings draw inferences about God from their everyday experiences, and looking at how these inferences are drawn in across different kinds of cultures, and also in the young and the not so young. Obviously, the religious sensibilities or intuitions of children are a very important area of research, and she's done a lot of work in this area. So I think rather than prattle on any further, I think I will ask Professor Petrovich to start her presentation. Normally when I give you a live talk, I'd say, would you please welcome and invite people to clap. We can't really do that, but although if you're visible, do clap away. And Professor Petrovich, welcome to this talk. Thank you for agreeing to take part electronically, which I know is not, you've been a little bit concerned about, but we practiced yesterday and it worked very well. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both for inviting me and for this generous and accurate introduction, I should say, because that is indeed what I have been interested in and doing most of the time. So being a psychologist, I'm aware that not many people who might be following the conference would be familiar with the terms that psychologists use, which are often really also philosophical terms, but have a different twist now in psychology. So I will make those differences clear very shortly. Yes, my main point in the lecture will be that natural theology is very natural to human beings across lifespan, across their development. The important similarities with academic or scholarly natural theology are that both specialists and children and lay people really do look to the natural world with that sort of interest of understanding its structure, its origin, its fundamental nature and causes. That is the main similarity. The other similarity that is only, it seems, beginning to be noticed by non-psychologists is that we do it all with our minds. So our very basic cognitive processes play a very crucial role, especially at the beginning, but also through our development. There is, of course, this big difference remains, and that is that the lay or everyday natural theology does begin very early, really very early. In fact, the building blocks are there well before any language appears, whereas the specialist or academic natural theology emerges later as a completely different structure with a lot of scientific knowledge from various domains. Now, let me just where is my PowerPoint? It seems to have, let me just disappeared briefly. Okay. Right, this is the, first, how do I get to the first slide now again?
Do you have your PowerPoint open?
Yes, it is open. In fact,
and you need to share the screen. So the bottom at the bottom in the middle.
Okay, share. Is that now visible?
That's perfect. Okay. And now I suggest you run the slideshow, and within the PowerPoint, it's about 6 buttons along, 7 buttons along from the left-hand side. Mm-hmm. It says slideshow. You just hit that button.
Okay, I have done.
Not quite working. Try again, please. That's it, and then go from the beginning. So
go from the beginning. Okay.
That's it.
That's great. Okay.
That's it. Everything's perfect. Thank you.
I knew that I forgot something from yesterday. I held it again. Okay, so these are the key terms that I will be using today: ontological categories, core domains, and theories, especially intuitive theories that children construct. So in philosophy and theology, of course, ontology means a different thing. It's an interest in the fundamental sort of nature of matter, of anything that exists, whereas psychologists have defined it as knowledge of what exists within the world. And I have followed that connotation of natural theology. So children's knowledge, there are, for example, categories such as animal or plant or artifact and so on. The key point in psychology is that ontological categories or ontological knowledge is that which highlights distinct ontological entities for each knowledge domain. For example, in biology, that's living organisms or life. In physics, inanimate things. In psychology, the mind and anything that the mind does. Okay, so ontological categories then determine what are the core domains of knowledge, and I have just mentioned 3. The point of my lecture will be that I am arguing actually that theology meets all the criteria that psychologists have outlined for defining core domains. So non-core domains are, as you can see here, chess, history, cookery. They just are a mix of other domains and do not depend on intuitive knowledge. So I now stop share, I presume, is that right? To go to the next slide.
I think you should just be able to click.
Or use the arrow buttons.
Very good, okay. So core domains of knowledge such as, and this is well supported by a great deal of empirical evidence in developmental psychology, they emerge early in development without any explicit teaching. They are similar across age, so there is very little change across development. Really, understanding of what mind does is basically the same in children and adults. And therefore, it is very likely to be cross-culturally universal. These conditions, of course, imply not only stability across development, but also suggest innateness. Now, innateness is not a very unusual term in modern psychology, because we do recognize that much of our cognitive competence does really come with a strong sort of dispositional genetic input. Theories, likewise, as Kuhn makes the point, that theories are imaginative posits, whether they come from scientists, ordinary people, or children. The point is that theories always represent something, sort of allow people to have a sort of a coherent system about the events in the world, and they, of course, involve postulating unobservable entities. The reason that children and the evidence showing that children do develop theories is that they really use them to make sense of their experience in causal terms. All theories, in fact, do involve some causal postulates. Let me see where, yeah. I do want to mention briefly the extent of infant knowledge that modern developmental psychology has really established, and all of it being relevant to my main topic today. By 9 months, these are all pre-verbal infants, they form global concepts of animals, of vehicles, furniture, and so these are abstract categories. Some studies have found that infants 2 months old. Now, a lot of these age differences would depend on the methods used and the stimuli used, of course. 3 months as well, that categories of animals and vehicles were not sort of formed on the basis of mobility of those objects, instances, but some more abstract criteria, usually causal and very often pertaining to how they started. Now, this may come as a sort of a surprise to many of you, but uniformly psychological developmental research has established and agrees that children are very knowledgeable about the origin of artifacts. They have no problems identifying artifacts as objects that were made by people. Do not confuse them with natural objects. But the claim in the literature, and this is throughout developmental psychology and philosophy and cognitive neuroscience, is that what children lack, and not only children, but even adults, is the very abstract, broad category natural. So they would understand that animals are not artifacts, plants are not artifacts, and so on, but they do not seem to be able to connect all these different natural into a single, very broad, abstract category natural. So, for example, Carey, who is a developmental psychologist, has suggested that that is really a philosophical concept rather than a natural concept. Well, I have argued that let me just go back to this. I have argued that that surely did depend very much on the criterion that children were given in the tasks when they were asked to identify natural and artificial objects. So that psychologists say they know that artifacts are all in a single category, whether they are familiar or unfamiliar objects, because people made them, they have that sort of common cause. But the reason they are very really unable to show any evidence of a single abstract category, natural, is that they lack sufficient scientific knowledge. They would need to know a great deal about intrinsic, causal, and other properties of different natural objects. And when they discover those or learn about them, they see that they couldn't be put together in the same category. Now, I have really thought about this quite a lot at the beginning of my studies, and realized that, of course, the fact that artifacts are made by people is an extrinsic cause. There is nothing intrinsic about artifacts to tell us really, or require us to know that they have certain properties. That's why they are in the same category. But to insist on natural objects, natural kinds, being placed in a single category on account of some intrinsic similarities can never lead to a single conceptual abstract category, because those causes, species-specific causes, are really intrinsic, whereas we need a similar parallel criterion that would be extrinsic. I was also struck by reading the literature, developmental literature about, of course, early causal development, and then claims about the Japanese sort of understanding of causation, and claims that they simply do not have a concept of cause in the same sense that Westerners do, as Ogawa, for example, argues. And he also argues then that the concepts of God, nature, and human being are all Western cultural products. And these are the views, of course, Watanabe and Kobayashi. Now, that struck me as really completely inconsistent with the vast body of empirical evidence in psychology, which documents very well in a few months old infants that they actually do use causal understanding in much of their behavior. So I did think then of doing a study with Japanese participants, a comparative study with Japanese and British. And I will briefly describe the tasks that I was using. I decided then to introduce this sort of two different concepts of origin. One is scientific or derived. How did this particular object come to be? And then to ask them to speculate, really, to think how the first ever object of the same kind began, and then in further study, how anything at all matter as well. Now, I'll show you some, these are irrelevant, really, the numbers of children in the study, but here are examples of stimuli that I was using. I should say that they were put together according to different conditions. In some conditions, there would always be one natural item, one artifact. In some would be both natural or both artifacts. One very interesting, these are familiar and unfamiliar were also very important, but let me just run through. Now, this is the most sort of captivating condition, not only for children, but for adults too. They were, a lot of adults looking at these pictures of objects were commenting on their own performance, saying, I never thought about it like this. It really focuses your mind. The questions really were to answer was which one could be made by people, or rather, really, if any of these two could be made by people, and then give a causal explanation how each of these two types of dogs came to be. And even children were, I mean, it was a really discovery for them too. They realized how much they knew actually about the intrinsic biological characteristics. This too, that's called a matched contrast condition. So that was interesting. Now, this was the most difficult condition, unmatched contrast, where you pair one really straightforward natural item and then the other, which is a natural category, cow, semantically natural, but looking at this particular example, it is actually artifact. And that condition really was the hardest for children. So there is no need, this is also a true artifact. So in one of the earlier studies, this is with British children and adults. I always actually compare children and adults, both in Britain and in Japan. You can see that, yes, adults do better in each of the three conditions, but their performance declines in the same conditions that children find difficult. So this difference actually wasn't even statistically significant when the contrast is very clear between natural and artificial items. Excuse me. All age groups performed really well. But with matched contrast, all the children, younger children were quite similar, whereas adults were better, scored higher. And unmatched contrast was actually the hardest for children. So in Japan, and I'll show you some more graphs, in fact, from Japan, I also, as I say, compared children and adults on this new task that I designed to differentiate objects according to their primary and derived origins for both natural and artificial items. And the similarities were really striking. There is absolute, first of all children understood the concept of cause and origin, even Japanese, even though that's claimed not to be the case, that they cannot cope with that. All the children from both countries score higher on derived and on primary origin. Now, primary origin was, the question really was to think about, as I said, the first ever item before there were any dogs, for example, how the first dog came into being. That was the hardest question for them to answer, even when the forced choice suggested the options. One would be corresponding with the evolutionary possibility, and the other one was God, and the third one would be something wrong as a control. Children were not so secure. I think later on I came to the conclusion that that really is because there are very few opportunities in the West and in Japan to actually talk about these things, how the first ever objects begin. Now, here are some graphs comparing British and Japanese children across the four conditions, natural derived objects and natural primary, and then artificial derived and artificial primary. Artificial derived is how this artifact came into being, and then how the first ever artifact of that guy. Now, many children really took that question to be like a sort of a trick question almost. But the answers that they gave, the wrong answers that they gave, were very interesting philosophically. For example, for many children, the first artifacts were actually created by God. When I asked them why they thought so, why they didn't think that the first people created these first artifacts, they would say, and this was really very similar, both Britain and Japan, that the first people didn't have ideas, that's the word that they use very often, or didn't know how, or didn't have the material. So it really was very interesting, but wrong. So that's why they, I had to score them, obviously, according to the, at face value, what they said first. So as you can see, British children do perform better than Japanese children, and this is for cultural reasons, no doubt. Japanese children are just not used to being asked these questions at all, or even talking formally to strangers about such things. Whereas, yeah, the Japanese, but the trend is the same. This is really, what is easy for British is easy for Japanese. It's easiest for all children to tell that artifacts are made by people. There is nothing more to ask about that. And then they can give very good answers for the natural objects, how they to identify their antecedents. But as I said, it was much harder to do it. And this is another experiment, the same thing, same trend. Now, when I compare in a later study, I wanted to see, because there were really quite a lot of studies suggesting that children's biological knowledge prevents them from giving accurate explanations for many categories. I then designed the second task, which was the task of animacy task, what is alive, what is not alive, but in different, tested in different ways. And comparing the three tasks, again, derived origin, identifying natural objects antecedents or artifacts antecedents, which they do not have, was very, very high. I mean, the maximum score was 6 in all of these conditions, but the majority of children were above 5 on average. That's the mean. Primary origin was equally hard for British and for Japanese. And the animacy task was actually Japanese children outperform British children. And this is important to point out. I later found when discussing these findings that in the Japanese language, it's a very, very clear usage of the words alive and not alive. They are used solely in the biological sense, never metaphorically or like in English, live yogurt, dead battery, live music, and so on. Now, I also used these methods with children who live in Britain but come from different religious and cultural backgrounds. They attend different faith schools. So there were several Christian denominations, but I didn't find any really significant differences between them. So I was using the single category: Christian, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, and non-faith schools. And again, you can see that the trends are very similar for these children as well. Derived origin is the easiest. Children can identify correctly the antecedents of different biological objects, categories. They are not as good with primary origin, even though they attend faith schools, as you can see. So much for being brainwashed in faith schools about God being everywhere. But also they found it in England. This just confirmed the Japanese finding that English-speaking children, no matter of their faith background, really do have difficulties learning, living, and alive what it means. So this is before I lumped different Christian denominations into one, so that you can see this is the same. Now, as I said, children do not just explain this object and stop there. They really do want to know how anything at all began, and I have a lot of data that I won't be presenting today, what they really want to ultimately know. But I did ask them the two cosmological questions: how a speck of dust, that is matter, came into being, whether some people think that it might have always been there, others think that God created it, and others have some sort of agnostic answer, which was differently phrased for children and for adults. And here are the findings, again, comparing a bit. This is very, very surprising, really, to those people who think that Japanese are just very different from Western people. The majority, of course, of British children say that matter began, but really quite 40% of them have the Japanese idea that matter never began. It was always there. And these are very coherent responses, really, very interesting. But this is also extremely interesting, that, of course, Japanese people, the majority, I mean, far more, significantly more than British, think that matter never began. It's always been there. But look at how many British people think the same. So these similarities are absolutely important if we are going to consider natural theology as a truly natural domain of human thought, as I think it is. Now, this is very interesting just to explain that I learned in Japan that this response, it was always there, need not mean it's always there. Many children just assume it just lasted a long time. It's been there for a long time. So I asked them the follow-up question then, what came first, speck of dust or God? And I all varied the order of presentation of that question. And even the children who said that matter was there or has always been there, never began, nonetheless say that God came first. So it's really very, very interesting to confirm that this phrase, it's been there always, does not mean the same thing. And this is identical, almost identical pattern. As you can see, the majority of faith schools children in England do think that also that matter began by God. But surprisingly, even though they are in faith schools, and you would think that they might be brainwashed to think otherwise, many hold the sort of eternal matter view, and also there are genuine agnostics. They just can't decide. It's a difficult question, no one knows, and that sort of thing. And the follow-up question likewise. So I think I have, these are the adult data from, but we don't, very similar. Even Japanese adults, you see the majority, the majority of Japanese adults also think that matter began. Not that it was eternal, even though that is the official cultural Japanese view that matter is eternal. But more Japanese adults think that it began than that it was eternal. So I will, I think, yeah, this is the, I can now stop, shall I say stop share, or how do I get out of the?
Yes, but stop share.
Okay, right. So I can now move on, just to remind myself what I wanted to say. Yes, the distinctions that I have mentioned, I mean, what this evidence really does tell us is several things relevant to natural theology. It does start early. These are very young children. They are aged 4 to 7 in different studies, but usually either 4, 5, and 6, or 5, 6, and 7. There were some older 3-year-olds as well, but they are small numbers, so I included them in the 4-year-old group. So it does start early. Children clearly do think, even in this age with so much sort of so many distractions in the way of television, various sort of new media opportunities, they still do think about the world. And the thinking is driven very strongly by the causal questions, and the causal questions are really appropriate to the topics that they are considering. They do not offer any sort of mechanical explanations, some implausible grounds how things began, but clearly thought out answers before being questioned. Now, this is called ontological knowledge in psychology, how much they know about the world. And I think I would want to argue that the evidence for that natural artificial dichotomy really is significant. It is a theory, a rudimentary theory of the world, which is accurate, by the way, because we do indeed can classify very clearly in a mutually exclusive manner anything that exists with regard to its ultimate cause, whether it is something that could be made by people or not. So that is a sufficient criterion to establish a well-defined ontological dichotomy. They do not need to actually show knowledge of the exact cause, but many of them do clearly have ideas, like adults do. The comparisons with adults, which I couldn't go into in any great detail, but are really very, very interesting. Their response to the method looks very simple, as I showed you, but it did elicit some profound thinking among adults. This is what they themselves said, that they never thought about the world in this way, that it really focuses their mind, that I'm changing my views as I go along. This was also a response that I heard several times. So ontological knowledge then, reliable ontological knowledge, needs to be verified in children and adults before we can really accept or look seriously into their speculations about God as its cause. Now, the only aspect of the concept of God that I have looked at and obtained evidence for is whether it is an abstract concept or not, or rather anthropomorphic. And it is abstract. It does meet the criteria of abstract concepts, which means that it is clearly differentiated from any other causal agents in the sense that it cannot be seen. The causal mechanism of its action is not the same as human. We don't know how. Children and adults do not know how, and so on. So I'm not presenting those data today. Some of the data from Britain and Japan I described in the book, 2019, but I'm currently analyzing that part of the study with 430 children from the faith schools, and as far as I can see, the patterns are really the same. So the evidence then for an abstract concept of God is strong, but the absolutely key point to make is that such evidence was obtained in the context of children's natural theological understanding of the world, that is looking at objects and thinking about their origins. I did not ever begin by asking them, what do you imagine God to be like, or out of that context, which many other studies have done. And that is where you do get a lot of misunderstanding. Children would mention various things that they have heard or at school or on television and so on. That's not a natural theological concept of God. So I'm really rather skeptical about some of that evidence. Now, I would like to say that many people following this conference would be familiar with Otter's book and his sort of concept of the holy or the holy other. I have found his account very, very consistent with modern psychological approach, because what Otter does is really tell us that this, in his view, a priori category of the holy or the holy other is always elicited by some stimuli, and that's what we ought to understand. Well, that is exactly what psychologists are trying to do, to explain any aspect of our knowledge, especially theoretical knowledge, with reference to the stimuli or the conditions that elicit it. So Otto's work is really very relevant. The concept of God then, this theological concept of God, does seem really to be a very simple concept. It is also a unique concept because evidence does show that children do not confuse it with any other causal agents. And that is possible to establish very neatly. I really have I have recorded or audio taped many of these interviews with children. They are absolutely stunning. I couldn't really believe that I was hearing some such things from 5 and 6 years old, their insights. So it's a very, very simple concept that no one forces upon them. In fact, I had over the years, occasionally there would be parents who wanted really to find out what the study is about because they were surprised by the behavior of their own children when they went home and started emulating my method with their siblings and parents asking them the same questions. And these parents would tell me, we never talk about these things at home. We were very surprised. So the children were really, really taken by, a few of them said, I know lots of things, don't I? Just discovering how much they know about the world, which they straightforwardly connect then with God. So you might then expect that such a concept, a salient concept in human cognition, because there is no other agent like God, like the creator of the natural world, or transcendence, I use it synonymously with that as well. You would think that such a concept will be very easy to remember forever, so to speak. But that is not the case. And I will later on mention, I mean, that appears not to be the case, judging by the statements that I have heard from many adults. Children's data are different, of course, because they have only lived 4 or 5 years. So developmental psychologists who have studied children's development of scientific knowledge, scientific concepts, I hope this is a test, but yeah, it's, I hope, did you hear the, yeah, okay, it does happen, but I didn't know that it would. We are in a different building now anyway. Tinbergen has been demolished, as you know. So the scientists who have studied children's scientific concepts, and really there is a very substantial body of work, excellent sort of rigorous research, they have argued that obviously there is a change, developmental change in those concepts in many ways from childhood to adulthood. And two main different mechanisms for that change have been suggested. One is that the fundamental core of an early scientific concept, say biological core concept or physical or psychological, undergoes a very fundamental change with development, with age. That's one view. The other view is that it doesn't really undergo fundamental change, but it becomes enriched in so many ways that even though the core remains, it is almost unrecognizable because it has been overlaid by the later and more sophisticated knowledge. Now, this is something to consider. In what sense really could it be applied when we speak of the development of the concept of God or the core theological concept? My view really is that neither of those two mechanisms are plausible in this case, simply because there is no information reaching the human cognitive processes, even at a very basic level, that could elicit any change of that sort. Scientists, of course, do change their various concepts because they discover more about nature. They do experiments, they do systematic observation. none of those things are possible in the case of the concept of God. There is really nothing that could alter it, but fundamentally as a core concept. So I think my view would be that the concept is a continuous, on a continuum. It doesn't change. It is simply, its only prospect is to be preserved as such, or lost, or rather sort of pushed into the background, and that does seem indeed to happen in many cases. These very basic, very simple core concepts of knowledge in human development are nowadays considered to be, in some sense, innate. Innateness is no longer understood in the sense that it was centuries ago. It doesn't mean that we are born with ready-made ideas to just deploy them when we sort of reach a certain stage. Rather, innateness refers to certain constraints, genetic constraints, you might say, that hold or obtain within the environment in which a human being lives, so that certain concepts do have to emerge given certain conditions. And I think it seems to me, that is my way of looking at much of the evidence here, is that the whole theological concept, which is really transcendence or God as a unique causal agent, no other attributes are really needed for its status of being the core concept in this domain, are of this kind. That does seem to be something in our sort of neural makeup that under certain conditions does lead to a deployment of a conceptual entity which does amount to this explicit concept. So even though I relied quite a lot on Ellman et al.'s book on conceptual innateness, in fact, the title of the book is Reconsidering Innateness, and then there is a subtitle. It's a very sort of really heavily neuroscientific book, but worth reading, especially for specialists, to understand what different meanings of innateness are alive in psychology. And one that is most plausible would be the idea that these innate constraints, they resemble Kantian categories. I think that's what most people will be familiar with, that they are not concepts, but given certain experience, they would become certain concepts, so to speak. So that both then nature, this our genetic predisposition, and the right sort of experience would lead to their inception and deployment. Of course, language is needed at a certain point to make them explicit as such. Some neuroscientists have used the category of primal, as opposed just to distance themselves from this rigorous idea of innateness, which really at that very rigorous level means that whatever is innate is the product solely of the interaction of the genes. There is nothing from outside that could alter that. Whereas in psychology, that of course wouldn't be possible, because we do respond to everything around us. So the question then is how much that experience, how it impinges on what is already there in our genes or neurons, and and how it affects any kind of restructuring that occurs. So the point, I think this now amounts to a sort of a bit of a really leisurely discussion, we might say, in some literature, whether to use, whether innateness is a better word, innate or primal. The point is that such concepts are inevitable in development. That's the key thing, where researchers are in agreement. We may never be able actually to get to that level of the neuronal representation of different concepts. And it is entirely possible that physical concepts of the physical aspects of the world are represented cortically in a different way than the metaphysical concepts, for which there are no specific stimuli, than largely relational concepts. So this kind of the idea that appeals to me certainly when considering where to place the core theological concept, for which in a way there is certainly there is no specific stimulus in the world that could be considered a better stimulus for triggering the concept of God. We are unable to. Would you say that this animal or that plant or the planets, is any of that a better signal, better trigger of the concept of God? No. It seems that the whole world really contains something within, rather that we establish the relations among the things that contain within the world, which then map cortically in a different way than any kind of physical stimuli can actually give us. I mean, you know, physical entities, physical quantities are represented differently from these concepts. And that is called equipotentiality, really, of certain areas of cortex where you can respond in the same way to a variety of stimuli. So the point is that really even Ellman and these rigorous connectionist scientists who try to explain everything at the level of the neurons admit that certain concepts, especially because their evidence comes mainly from vertebrate animals and laboratory experiments rather than life in the real world, where people construct theories, even children, as Carmilov Smith says, you can't map children's theories cortically easily. So it does then really seem that we are sort of led to an agreement among the neuroscientists that there will always be a possibility, we cannot rule it out, that some abstract concepts might be sort of really pre-specified neuronally, but that wouldn't be a really scientific or psychological explanation, because we do not have a means of arriving at that. But this account that I have conveyed to you, and which to me does seem really very consistent with the evidence that I have encountered in my studies of this domain of thought, is that it is compatible with both nativism and empiricism. We do need experience. We do need stimuli from the real world in order to deploy this concept, but it is not any kind of specific experience. So that really allows us to assume that even human beings with very little, or rather with substantial handicaps, actually may have sufficient information to arrive at this concept at some point. And so now, just a word, I couldn't possibly go into this area in great detail. language development is absolutely essential and may provide quite an explanation for why some of this concept does not sort of live into adulthood of many human beings, so to speak, although having done research with adults, I'm personally very skeptical that that is the case. But anyway, language is important for all abstract concepts to be encapsulated if there is nothing to help us sort of attached to it, it's very difficult to sustain it in memory. And of course, memory itself, what research has established that, for example, ironically, all this fantastic development in children's early understanding of the world that occurs in the first 2-3 years of life, sadly is lost in memory because of the nature of human memory development. That, of course, is determined largely by the anatomical properties of the human brain and how it develops, also by the channel processing capacities. There are so many things that, that could interfere, but memory development combined with the lack of language or to label some of these concepts in the first 3 years of life really does explain quite a lot why it may seem to so many people that they had never thought about God or just learned it from others consider themselves basically to be agnostics, if not atheists, straight away. So I could say a few more things, but on the other hand, I have run through, so to speak, my main points and could stop here if that is fitting with your timetable for any questions, if there are.
Thank you very much. That's absolutely fascinating. And I think